This is SSN.
Stories Studio Network.
The Change for Good Roads podcast series brings together influential Canadian experts from sectors of sustainable cities, equity, accessibility, physical activity, mobility, and road safety to discuss how to increase support for road safety action. Hosted by Parachute's President and CEO Pamela Fuselli, each episode will feature a discussion with an expert on urban road safety. Today, we're going to discuss the importance of mobility for all and the accessibility of urban spaces as key components of healthy, active, and safe urban roads. While we recognize the complexity of this issue, changing the culture around how we design and use streets, roads, and other public spaces to be more accessible and inclusive to road users beyond drivers will improve road safety. For urban roads to be truly accessible, they must be inclusive, safe, and usable for all. Traditionally, accessibility has referred to people with differing levels of mobility or disability. Road safety experts emphasize that this must be extended to include gender, cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic status, geographies, as well as a variety of other factors that can make road users vulnerable. In urban design and the built environment, collaboration with communities and facilitation of interest group involvement in planning and design should reduce systemic barriers to safe roads for everyone. Joining me today is Dr. Michelle Porter. Dr. Porter is a leading expert in aging and physical activity, holding multiple degrees, including a Bachelor of Physical and Health Education, a Master of Science, as well as a PhD and postdoctoral fellowship in Boston and Scandinavia. She is currently the director of the Center on Aging at the University of Manitoba and a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America. Her current work focuses on ageism, quality of life in long-term care, the WHO's Healthy Aging Action Plan, and an international project in artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles. She also holds executive positions with various provincial and national organizations. Dr. Porter, thanks for being part of Parachute's Change for Good Roads podcast. So starting off, the first question I would ask is, how would you define accessibility in general? I've also heard the term universal, and are those the same thing or are they different?
Well, I guess what I was going to talk about was the Public Health Agency of Canada, its definition of age-friendly. But if I replace some of the terms that they have in their definition, I think you can see that this would suit a lot of what you said in your introduction. So, in an accessible community, the policies, services, and structures related to the physical and social environment are designed to help, and I'll take out older, but in their definition they have older, people age actively. In other words, the community is set up to help people live safely, enjoy good health, and stay involved. So, as I said, I think if you remove the context of age, although we all hopefully will be aging, it really, I think, gives you the sense it is the policies, the services, it's also the physical, but it's also the social environment that respects everyone who is living in a particular community. So I think that's a pretty good definition for what we could think about as being an accessible community. And in their definition, they're talking about age-friendly, but I think they're quite synonymous. And so you can certainly apply that to the transportation realm. You can apply that to roadways. So I think you can just substitute in a few things and have a pretty good definition that would enable all people to be able to enjoy the communities that they live in.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent goal and something that we should be striving for, because the more people that can interact with communities and society, the better off we are. So how would you define accessibility on our roads in particular? And you touched on it a little bit in the definition and the communities that those roads go through and provide access to.
Those roadways and the communities, they should allow movement. So that's the key to the whole transportation system. They're there to allow movement. So they should allow that movement around communities for work, school, volunteering, accessing supplies and services, socializing, and also participating in recreation and physical activity.
Hmm.
And then finally, just in general, engaging as a citizen. And I think it's interesting, again, a lot of my examples that I'm going to use today because of my background in the field that I work in right now is related to older people. But it's interesting that in the United States, the Federal Highway Administration handbook for designing roadways for the aging population, they in fact say that, in effect, for many aspects of road planning and design, the design driver and the design pedestrian of the early 20th first century will likely be 65 and older. So the design person that they've kept in mind when they've been designing roadways has not been the older person. And so we've seen things like pedestrian crosswalk signals that don't allow enough time for the typical older person, or certainly a slower older person, to actually make it across the roadway in time. And so we need to really change that thinking as our population is becoming older. It would be really important that we're making sure that we're designing our roadways for older people, whether it's as drivers or other road users. And then, of course, that's going to make it better for everyone in society, not just older drivers. So some of the kinds of things that would be examples of how to design a roadway differently, for example, would be a protected left turn. So we see those more and more at our intersections, and clearly they prevent collisions. They're great for older drivers because making those left-hand turns are, really challenging cognitively. There's a lot going on to make the appropriate decision of when to accelerate through the intersection. But clearly, that's a good thing for everyone to have those protected left turns. And, there's other examples. It's a very large handbook. It might sound like it's more like a brochure, but it's not. It's many hundreds of pages long. And there's all sorts of examples, whether it's to do with lighting, signage, the configuration of curves, et cetera. So that's a really good example of an organization thinking about accessibility of roadways.
And you've touched on some of the issues that you're seeing, and you've given an example of what's good or helpful. And I think without having some of those experiences ourselves, you don't realize what even something very small, for example, my mom is using a wheelchair now. And so just pushing her along a roadway and the smallest lip or unsmooth or unlevel sidewalk, or as you go into an intersection, it's a huge barrier. So can you talk a bit about what needs to be improved and what kind of issues you're seeing on our roads and in communities right now?
Sure. Well, a big one in Winnipeg right now, and this goes on for several months every year, is the condition of our roadways with snow.
Hmm.
So, because of our climate here, we don't get a huge amount of snow, but we do get a lot of cold. And so, when we do get snow, that's snow does not melt off the roadways, and we don't always get it cleared before there's lots of traffic. So we get hard packed, slippery surfaces, whether it's the roadways or the sidewalks or the sides of roadways where there are no sidewalks. And that's really a huge issue. For drivers, it can be an issue because it's really hard to see where you are on a multi-lane roadway. There's no markings visible, and if everything is just white across all three lanes, say, it is really hard to gauge where you are in the lane. So for drivers, that can be challenging. Certainly, it can lead to collisions, but it could also probably deter people from going out because they're not going to feel very comfortable driving. Then, of course, a lot more challenges for people that are walking. As you said, if you're trying to use a wheelchair in those conditions, it can be virtually impossible. And so what we end up seeing happening a lot in Winnipeg, and there's been several examples shown either on social media or in the mainstream media, where people who are using mobility scooters or wheelchairs are actually having to forego using the sidewalks where they should be and having to be on a busy roadway because there's just no way for them to actually make it down a sidewalk. And so there's really been a lot of calls. Last year was a very snowy winter in Winnipeg. There's been a lot of calls for needing to prioritize the sidewalks in terms of snow clearing. And we're really in a catch-22 because we just don't have enough equipment. It's never been a big priority, and it has all sorts of other ramifications. People like to be able to get out to walk, and even in the cold, that could be safe to do if you dress appropriately. But unfortunately, it can be very dangerous. Those slippery sidewalks can lead to falls, and falls are very dangerous for anyone, leading to fractures. But for older people, it can really be challenging. So, we do have older people who end up being kind of prisoners of their own home for potentially weeks, if not months at a time, because of the conditions of the spaces around where they live. And, getting to bus stops, again, those bus stops aren't always cleared. They're not always set up for people who use mobility aids to begin with. In my neighborhood, I know that's the case. There are no sidewalks, and the bus stops, you have to be able to get up and over a curb to get to the stop. So if not, you're standing on the road or sitting on the road if you're in a wheelchair. So that certainly is a big concern. And, a lot of places don't necessarily have as much winter to deal with as we do in Winnipeg, but that is something that's receiving a lot of attention. And hopefully we will see a better situation because we are in Manitoba. There is a new accessibility standard coming into place surrounding transportation, and it certainly calls for, with at least the transit system, that there has to be good clearage of snow during the winter months.
Yeah, and I can see that being an issue with even parents, and especially moms that are pushing strollers and different things that need that access and the clearing of roads, and they may not want to go out in those conditions because they are afraid of not being able to get past at all, but also slipping on those roadways that haven't been cleared, and their comfort level. And the next question kind of leads into that, because, and you touched on this with the older adults, inaccessible roads and travel impacts on individual safety and health and well-being in different levels. So can you talk about a little more about what that impact is when we don't have accessible roadways, and the ability for everyone to get around?
One example for me would be even just that snow again, the lack of clearing. It might prevent me from going out for as many walks as that I might. So, and we know that physical activity is beneficial in so many different ways for people's physical as well as mental health. I notice, for example, I'm not so worried about falling in some situations, but the uneven surfaces
Mm-hmm.
as I get older, my knees and my hips don't really like those uneven surfaces all that much. So that's just another example that people might not be thinking about, but having those uncleared sidewalks with clumps of snow here and there, and it's just makes it painful, literally, potentially for some people to walk as compared to having a nice, smooth surface existing. And, related to mental health, I talked about people being, and that's not just older people, it can be people with disabilities as well. Maybe they go to work, but that's all they do. They don't do any other recreation or other leisure pursuits because it's just too challenging. It's too exhausting to deal with it. And social isolation is a huge issue, and it in and of itself can really lead to a lot of health issues, and studies have shown decreased longevity. So there are certainly lots of examples, and then just people's ability to engage in society. So if you're not able to get out, how much are you able to see other people, go to medical appointments, engage in routine programming that might be good for your mental and physical health. So all of these kinds of things can be affected by whatever the accessibility challenge might be. And, in some cases, It's not just snow in Winnipeg that's an issue. There's other safety concerns. So if there's neighborhood safety issues, that can be an accessibility issue that affects anyone of any age. The transit system, we have some safety issues right now with crimes being committed. And so that for sure is going to deter some people. And for those that don't own a vehicle, again, that might mean that they're just foregoing trips that they would have made because they just don't feel safe enough to get on a bus. So all of these things can really have big implications for people. Also economically, transportation, it can be a huge issue for, having access to jobs in different locations. And if it takes you an hour and a half to get to and from work, that's going to limit the potential opportunities that you might take up in terms of employment.
And oftentimes it impacts those who are, more vulnerable or experiencing vulnerability, like people with disabilities or people in low socioeconomic areas. You see a lot of these inaccessible issues like lighting, and as you say, the upkeep of sidewalks or roadways that are impassable or not easy to use with mobility aids, the removal of snow, all of those things, and health. I mean, it even just going out and get groceries, a lot of things that you and I don't even think twice about is a real issue. And so is it then they're ordering in food that maybe isn't as healthy as that what they would normally be able to get if they can get out and about. So there's so much intricacies and interdependencies on so many issues. What are some of the resources or tools that city planners or engineers can use or approaches as they design these roads and outdoor spaces for accessibility, or even, roadways that exist now but, need some work on, whether they're digging up a road for sewers or whatever, that there might be an opportunity to kind of retrofit, if you will, existing streets, never mind new designs?
So I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to be able to give a lot of engineering solutions, but certainly that manual that I talked about, the handbook on designing roadways for the aging population, I think it has a lot of good information. It's available for free online. You don't have to purchase it. The Public Health Agency of Canada has some great information related to age friendly. And as I said, while it is specifically targeting older people, the benefits would be for anyone of any age. And certainly they've got some checklists and things that could be done there. One thing we haven't talked about yet is, and it's a relatively new thing, is making communities dementia friendly. So we know we're going to have a lot more people with dementia just because of the aging of our population, although overall rates are actually going down, but because of the aging of the population, we're going to see more older people with dementia. And hopefully, if we have all the appropriate services and things in place, they'll be able to live in their own homes rather than in the long-term care setting. But we do need to do things to make our communities dementia friendly as well. And that could be through providing appropriate training to people who work in the transportation sector. But there are physical things that can also be done to make our communities more dementia friendly in terms of having good, clear wayfinding, other signage for directions, having benches. An interesting point that came up with one document was saying, and don't have benches that are abstract looking. They need to look like benches. They can't be artwork that is kind of like a bench because people won't be able to understand that. Again, the smooth surfaces. So the Alzheimer's Society of Canada and provincial Alzheimer's societies have good information related to dementia friendly. Something else we haven't talked about yet either is the speeds on roadways.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly something that lots of cities around the world are looking at or have already changed to reduce the speeds on roadways, which decreases the likelihood of collisions, decreases the severity of collisions, and I would also argue would make people feel more comfortable potentially on the roadways. If you're a pedestrian and people are driving slower, that's going to make you feel more comfortable, particularly if there are no sidewalks in your neighborhood. But even if there are sidewalks, that's going to make you feel safer. And I would also say for older drivers, they often feel pressured to drive faster than they feel comfortable doing so because most people, in fact, are speeding on our roadways. And so the WHO has a good website on the Streets for Life campaign and talking about having slower speed limits, particularly on residential streets, which I think is really important for communities to take up. I think we're slow. Certainly in Manitoba, we're slow to do this. We have a couple of pilot projects going on right now, but I'm not sure we really need to have pilots. I think it's pretty evident that it's a good thing to do based on what's happened in other communities. But that speaks to the primacy that vehicle drivers have, and they're just completely against anything that would reduce the speeds on roadways, most of them, not all of them, obviously. But I think we could be doing a lot more education as well, just on kind of that systems approach
Mm-hmm.
to road safety that I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate. And so if we did more of that education, I think we might get more buy-in. Right now, a lot of people just see lower speed limits as a cash grab because more people are going to get fines. But it is pretty obvious that it's a good thing to do from a number of different perspectives. And maybe it would get more people engaging in active transportation, which would also be good for people's health. But knowing that, if a collision should happen, if that vehicle is driving at a lower speed, that would be much less severe of a type of collision. There are things also happening, I think, that's really interesting on the vehicle front.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of some of the safety systems that are being put into vehicles, even before we get to fully autonomous vehicles. So, just some of the emergency braking that vehicles will do. Obviously, that's a great thing and good for those residential and other areas where there's going to be pedestrians and cyclists. Even the design of some vehicles to have less impact, literally
Mm-hmm.
impact on pedestrians if there should be a collision. Unfortunately, it seems like we're really, in terms of our buying choices of vehicles, we're going in the wrong direction. And I don't think many of our large trucks and SUVs are that safe for pedestrians. In fact, they're not. And I don't think we're doing a lot of design on those particular vehicles. And those are the types of vehicles that people are more likely to be purchasing right now. So I'm just wondering, like the government is putting in regulations related to how many electric vehicles people are going to be need to be buying. Maybe we need to have some regulations on buying vehicles that are safer for pedestrians and other road users, because it doesn't seem like that's where it's going in terms of consumers right now. And I'm worried that even when we switch to having electric vehicles, they're electrifying all sorts of very large vehicles still. So we're still
Mm-hmm.
going to have those road safety problems if we just have everyone now using big electric. And in fact, those electric vehicles, they're all heavier than standard vehicles because of the batteries that they have in them. So, there are some road safety implications, even with electric vehicles, particularly if you've got an electrified Hummer, it's not going to be making the roads any safer.
I think what you've talked about really brings home how individual choices can impact on others in your community. And Change for Good Roads, one of the things that we've been looking at is that intersectionality of how complex and how interdependent a lot of these are. And when you have conversations with the different road users and they tell you about their experiences, I think that comment about the benches having to look like benches is really key in understanding what is the experience of the different road users and the different people in our communities and their needs for accessibility and issues that the road designers, I'm not an engineer either, but the road designers and the urban planners and those who are thinking about our spaces and planning and have decision making control over that can take those experiences and individual needs into account. So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's been really interesting in exploring all the different accessible needs and some things that we are already seeing in place, and hopefully more so as the years go on. So thanks so much, Dr. Porter.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. Change for Good Roads is a podcast of Parachute, Canada's national injury prevention charity, whose mission is for Canadians to live long lives to the fullest by preventing serious and fatal injuries. We release episodes of this podcast monthly on the second Tuesday of the month. Change for Good Roads is made possible through the generous support of our road safety partner, Desjardins Insurance. On the next episode, we'll be talking about physical activity and road safety. You can find the Change for Good Roads podcast on Spotify and Apple iTunes. Make sure to use the hashtag Change for Good Roads when you share the podcast with others on social media or by sending a link out to your networks. Subscribing to the podcast and giving it a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts will also help listeners find this podcast.
This is Story Studio Network.